But it seems to me like there's just a little bit of a difference in how the news media have been reporting these two stories, which at their base are largely similar. You may have seen some of these videos coming out of China recently. Now, the story, as I understand it, is this authoritarian Chinese government is placing severe restrictions on its citizens, and it's curtailing what few civil liberties they had prior to these restrictions. And it's doing so all in the name of public safety. That is, to prevent further spread of the COVID-19 virus. I can only imagine what this is like for Chinese citizens living there. Some Chinese citizens, although certainly not all of them, are upset to the point that they are marching in the street to demand change from their government. Now, understand that their concerns are one of lack of civil liberties, that these restrictions put in place by the Chinese Communist government are too restrictive. They do too much to curtail people's rights to move freely in their country. And two, I think they're concerned that these measures, despite being very restrictive, are having little to no impact on actually stopping the spread of COVID-19. And this has caused many Chinese citizens, or a significant minority of them, to take to the streets and speak out against these restrictions. Now, the Chinese government has indicated that it's not going to sit idly by as people protest. Instead, they are cracking down on these protests in an attempt to quell them. There are reports that police are stopping citizens and searching their phones, looking to see if they have VPNs loaded on their phones, and looking at their social media posts to see if these citizens are saying things that are against the Chinese government. And long before these protests, the Chinese government has controlled the media in that country. Basically, there is a state-run media that is basically the only news media that's allowed to report on what's going on. And it seems the Chinese government is taking a number of measures to try to contain this protest. First, they are doing what they can to control the narrative itself. The state-run media is basically just ignoring the protests. They're not reporting on it at all. And there's also some reports that there are a number of, I guess, nationalistic bloggers, as I understand it. And that is bloggers who are sympathetic to the Chinese government, who are, propagating a certain narrative, saying that this protest has been, I'm not sure if it's foreign funded, or at least there's been foreign influence to create these protests. So it seems that the Chinese government is taking steps to certainly physically quell these protests, but also, perhaps more important, or just as important, to control the narrative around them. Now, there are a lot of people that find this troubling, that find it difficult to hear about human rights being trampled on so overtly. Now, at the same time, I suppose it is at least understandable, as regrettable as it is. I think a lot of people have come to just know that the Chinese government generally does not allow dissent, and certainly does not allow free protests, and it's just sort of the way that that government works to quell these protests, to shut them down. It's not the same as our tradition in the West. It's not like other countries, more in the Western tradition, that hold in high esteem civil liberties and human rights and the importance of a free and open press that can report on the government and on what's going on in society. It's not like a country like Canada or Australia or New Zealand, where these values are held in high esteem. Unfortunately, it's a country that has, I guess, a different outlook, a different government structure, where criticizing the authorities is something that's absolutely not acceptable. Of course, if you have a particularly good memory and you can think back like many, many months back to February of this year, you might recall that something at least somewhat similar happened here in Canada, happened in the nation's capital in Ottawa. While they're not quite the same thing exactly, they are of a similar kind, I would argue. Basically what happened here in Canada, and specifically Ottawa, is we had a government that had fairly restrictive policies on COVID, specifically requiring people to show proof of vaccine in order to freely move about their country. And in particular, there was a few truckers that got together who were upset with what they saw as a government overreach. Now, I can't quite put my finger on it, but it seems like there's something that's just a little bit different about how our news media are reporting on these Chinese protests compared to how they reported on similar protests happening here in Canada. I'm not sure if it's the words they're using exactly or the overall tone or some of the rhetoric, but it just seems to have a different feel when you look at some of the news reports coming out of China now compared to some of the news reports from Ottawa from the very same media outlets. So just to refresh your memory, here's basically how they're reporting the protests in China.
In China, there is growing anger over Beijing's attempts to contain a surge of COVID-19 cases.
Well, these really were extraordinary videos coming out of Xinjiang province showing hundreds of people taking to the streets protesting against this zero COVID chaos.
A population past its breaking point after nearly 3 years of restrictions, even repression, with no end in sight.
And here's a little bit about what they have to say about the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa.
David, you've looked very closely at the demonstration in Ottawa this weekend. How would you describe what you saw?
Many various harmful images that we've been seeing, violent images, including swastikas, including other violent imagery that...
As a protest convoy arrives in Ottawa, many have raised concerns about people with extreme views that have attached themselves to that protest.
They show us the extremism of some of the people who are participating in this illegal occupation.
China?
Defiance and support for the protest action that was taking place in China. We saw people gathering and holding up pieces of plain white paper, a message of their inability, they said, to show real protest towards the government of the Communist Party in China.
And Ottawa.
I mean, I'm sure you've been to Ottawa over the past 16 days. It is a state of chaos, I think that's fair to say, in the downtown core.
Protests in China.
Outrage is growing in China over the government's harsh COVID-19 lockdowns. Protests against Beijing's strict policies are spreading now across the country.
And protests here in Canada.
Let's be clear, this is basically a hostage taking. They have moved in. I mean, I think there was a lapse of judgment from the Ottawa police to allow them to be on a road where they are 40 meters from the House of Commons. They could do great damage if they wanted to, and parked right next door to the Prime Minister's office. I mean, it is insane that this has been allowed to happen. For the Conservative Party, the so-called Law and Order Party, to be giving their tacit approval to something that is an occupation is crazy to me. You do not need to be taking your picture with people who are engaging in possibly, as the Ottawa Police Chief has said, violent activities that are foreign funded.
But it seems to me like there's just a little bit of a difference in how the news media have been reporting these two stories, which at their base are largely similar. There's a subset of each population that feels that it's government policy vis-a-vis COVID-19 and the restriction placed upon people, whether it be physically locked in a building, which I'll admit is more extreme than what we had in Canada, but it's of a similar kind, even though it varies by degree, versus the trucker convoy, where they're upset about the government requiring truckers to take what is essentially an experimental medical intervention in order to move freely across the border in order to do their jobs. Are these stories essentially the same? And if so, why does the reporting seem to be so different? You let me know what you think in the comments below.
I want to bring Evan into this conversation. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you know about some of these specific groups who have been involved in this protest?
From day one, the people who have organized this thing have been what we follow in the far right. The organizers of the GoFundMe are on record making very Islamophobic comments in the past.
In a place where protesting can be deadly, white pages beckon people to simply fill in the blank, if you will. Anger about lack of freedoms or economic struggles, cries for the end of the rule of Xi Jinping, and they infuriate authorities.
This unlawful activity has to end, and it will end. Of course, I can't say too much more now as to exactly when or how this ends, because unfortunately we are concerned about violence. Small fringe minority of people who are on their way to Ottawa or who are holding unacceptable views that they're expressing do not represent the views of Canadians who have been there for each other.
Freedom! 我们不要人！